It is my pleasure. I'm going to be introducing Jesse Edsell-Vetter. And Jesse is the Hoarding Intervention Coordinator for the Metropolitan Boston Housing Partnership. Mr. Vetter led the establishment of the Metropolitan Boston's Housing, Hoarding, and Sanitation Initiative, and in May 2006, as a staff member of that division, the Inspectional Services Department, he noticed increasing incidents of failed Section 8 apartment inspections, something we all see around here too. Many of the subsequent evictions were due to hoarding. With the support of the Metropolitan Boston Housing Partnership, he researched hoarding and its impact on housing, and in November of 2007, he transitioned to a full-time hoarding case manager. He now serves as a resource to the Boston area legislators, government, human service agencies, and social service providers. He has provided training, technical assistance, and advocacy around the country. He serves on numerous committees and boards, including the Massachusetts Steering Committee on Compulsive Hoarding. Here, I'd like to introduce Jesse Edsell-Vetter.
Hi, everyone. We've heard the academic and clinical perspective on hoarding. We've heard from Lee about his experience as someone who struggles with finding and keeping, and from Becca as this loved one and support system. And for many of us in the community, we want to be supportive and often are in roles where traditionally we are the big stick in the enforcement side of things. And so that perspective is a little bit different. But it doesn't always have to be. And so I want to talk a little bit today about how to do our enforcement work through a community context that allows us to have a little bit of a supportive lens in all of that. So talk a little bit about what are some of the health and safety issues, what are some of the perspectives on code enforcement and how that happens. Most importantly, what does community collaboration look like? Because one of the things that we are increasingly learning, as Dr. Frost said, is we can't rely just on mental health professionals to address this. It really does need to be a collaborative effort. So what are the range of options there? And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the program that I coordinate at Metropolitan Boston Housing Partnership. We started our program 9 years ago, and got some data that we've just released on that program. 98% of the folks that we work with, we've been able to reduce the clutter enough that they're able to stay in their homes. And that clutter level stays down for the long term, for a period of several years for the folks that we've been able to follow. So I'm going to talk about how we did that a little bit. In looking at this photo, when I came into doing this work, it was very much from a code enforcement perspective. We have 13 code enforcers at my agency that oversee about 10,000 Section 8 housing units. And so that was the lens that I had. I was joking last night, I was very much the clean it up, I don't care sort of guy, and it really was. And I knew that there was more to it, to the problem of clutter or hoarding, but it wasn't my problem. That was somebody else's job. That's kind of where I was coming from. And so what I was going in and seeing was lack of egress path here. The egress path in this particular gentleman's unit is maybe 12 inches wide instead of the 36-inch our firefighting friends would like. We'd see a lot of fire hazards, a lot of dust, potential for mold and things like that. We were driving around a bit yesterday and getting some information about how the recovery process from Sandy was happening, and one of the first things that I was thinking about was the potential for black mold or all of those kinds of things when you have that level of water damage. And so my first instinct is just to look at the health and safety, right? Anybody else have that as the first instinct? It's okay, you can be honest. And really it comes from a place of wanting to help people, right? We don't want to see people harmed. We don't want to see EMTs or firefighters harmed. We don't want to see the residents harmed. But at the same time, we often get in our own way in terms of wanting to get these units safer. So the way of thinking generally tends to be, you've got to clean this up, it's dangerous, you're going to lose your housing. We kind of go into panic mode. And so it's a little bit of unlearning to stop having that message and still get the units into compliance. Oftentimes when we're kind of walking in and we're a little panicked over what we're seeing, These kinds of words might be some of what is going on, even if we don't like to admit it to the outside world. This is unsanitary. This is a bunch of stuff you should get rid of. It's dangerous. You're out of control. All of these really negative thoughts, right? And so the way that I've come to think about this is when we have those negative thoughts, really we're focusing on the tip of the iceberg, talking about the saving, we're seeing the acquiring, and we're seeing the physical clutter, but that's really not the entire picture of the challenges around hoarding and clutter. And the way that I've come to think of this issue over time is very much like an iceberg, where those physical manifestations are just the tip of the iceberg. And where we go wrong in the clean it out approach, in terms of addressing this problem historically, is that we then aren't paying attention to the mental health issues. We're not paying attention to the family dynamics. We're not paying attention to the executive function histories, concerns about memory, whether they're actual memory problems or fear around memory. All of these different kinds of experiences, trauma and loss experiences. And so when we go and clean out homes, and then 6 months or a year later, we're spending tens of thousands of dollars cleaning it out again, that's more because we haven't done an appropriate intervention than anything else. And that was a really big learning moment for me. We've spent $15,000 cleaning out a home and we're spending it again. And that's our error, in my perspective, because when we were doing the intervention, we were so busy focusing on that physical environment that we missed all of the skill building and mental health and other components. So what I'd like to talk to you about today is a little bit of a different way to approach that. Rather than having all of those judgmental words, kind of what we want to think about is more things like this, the reality that people have all of those physical health and safety issues, but what's underneath it is depression, being really down, feeling sad, feeling sluggish, feeling a little out of control for some folks. And so we need to incorporate these kinds of phrases into our planning process so we can start to address these kinds of feelings. So we're shifting from clean this up, you're creating a dangerous situation, to, hey, I'm really concerned about your safety and the safety of the folks around you. Can we have a conversation? And so it goes from being a very top-down, dictatorial kind of approach to a collaboration with the resident. And that's not even getting to the point where we're bringing in other collaborators. This is one of the things that I realized early on. I would go in, I'd say, clean it up. I'll be back in 30 days. Tell me if this sounds familiar to anyone. Come back in 30 days. There's very little, if anything, done. And I would get really frustrated. I'd be pretty angry. What I came to realize is that if the folks that I was going in to do inspections with could do it on their own, they would. And they just didn't have those resources. And so that's where that collaborative piece becomes so important. So let's talk a little bit about one of the first things we need to do to be successful around the collaboration piece and the enforcement piece is to change how we think about the assessment process a little bit. And we oversee 32 cities and towns in our service area, and so we've done a lot of work with those cities and towns to implement some of these, and it's night and day compared to what it was 9 years ago when we started. So historically, we think of the enforcement side of things and the housing and public health as being responsible for identifying what the health and safety violations are, getting those written up so that someone can either come into compliance or we can end up with court situations or fines or those kinds of punitive things, right? Establishing a timeline for when the next inspection is and what those consequences are, and then determining whether or not someone has met those benchmarks that we set out. So notice in that there's no collaborative process. There's no offer of support. That's somebody else's problem, right? Or so the story goes. Where I'd like to introduce some changes are making referrals for assistance. One of the things that we started to do in our program when we were doing starting our intervention process is we said, okay, so someone fails inspection, if they have a clutter image rating, and we're going to look at that slide in just a second. It's a great tool that Dr. Frost developed with his students at Smith. Once someone has a clutter image rating of a 5 or higher, automatically the inspector makes a referral to a group of people. Largely, it was a couple of hours to start with, and now we've got a full-time team, but there is a referral process in place, and that was a change in perspective. We used to say, okay, here's the phone number, tenant. You have to be the one to call. Good luck to you. And so that was a real shift for us in terms of how to do business, that it has made all the difference in terms of getting people the help that they need. The next thing is providing information to stakeholders. And I had an interesting conversation with our inspection staff about this, because often when I talk with code enforcement folks and housing folks who have done those first steps of identifying the violations and the consequences and all of those kinds of things, it hasn't occurred to them to explain the legal language that a lot of code enforcement is written in to other stakeholders. They say, well, I give you an inspection report, that should tell you what you need. And so there's that ongoing dialogue that often gets missed. We have a couple of inspectors who are particularly good doing the dialogue in our department. And so I said to them one day, why do you invest so much time rather than just writing up the report and passing it on? And every single one of them said, it saves me so much time if I communicate clearly with the resident. Here are the things that I need done in very basic English. Here are the things that I need from the social worker so that they understand, or the clinician. And I don't have to go back 15 or 20 times when I do that. I go back a few times and I know that there's a team of people and we're checking in about that. And so for those of you who are in more of an enforcement role or a professional role, I would encourage you to start kind of reaching out and doing some networking here to think about how you can start communicating a little bit differently. It doesn't have to be radically differently. We're not asking you to step into a social work role, but communicating somewhat differently around what you're seeing in the field. So there are a few different tools that we use very consistently in terms of the housing inspections and working with public health and other agencies. First is having a very clearly written health and safety report. So I used to see a lot of reports that said clear clutter or fire hazard. So for those of you who aren't in a code enforcement role, if you got an inspection report or a piece of paper that said clear clutter or fire hazard, you have 30 days. How many of you would feel 100% confident you could help the resident come into compliance with that? Do you feel like you have enough information? No. I know all of the codes, and I frequently didn't know what clear clutter or fire hazard always meant. And so what we've done is, instead of having people write things like that, we will instead get reports now that say, clear a 36-inch egress path from the front door to the rear exit and one window in each room. That's a very, very different kind of inspection report, right? So doing things like that. There's a Holmes tool that Dr. Christiana Bradiotis at University of Nebraska, Omaha developed for the Massachusetts Steering Committee on Hoarding, and it's great because it literally takes 3 minutes to fill out. There's a section for homes, garbage and trash overflow, cannot sleep in the bed, cannot access the toilet, things like that, health issues. Obstacles like impeded egress, worry about avalanche risk or things like that, trip hazards. Area for concerns around mental health if someone's seems to be overly defensive or anxious, those kinds of things. Endangerment, threat to a child, person with a disability, animals, or elders. And then structure and safety. Some of the homes that we certainly see, the floors are a little bit soft because there's just too much weight on the structure, porch collapse, all of those things. And so any time that we get an inspection report now from the 32 cities or towns or from our code enforcement department, we get a very clear inspection report. We get the homes tool, and then we get the clutter image rating for each of the rooms in the home. And the nice thing about that is everybody has a very clear idea in plain, basic English. We're not asking people to read the codes of what specific changes, and it can be read by the resident and anyone working with them. It makes it a lot easier to develop an intervention process for someone when we all are speaking the same language and have some shared language. So let me show you Dr. Frost's clutter image rating, because that's going to be important toward the end of our time to look at some of the outcomes that we see in terms of change in clutter image rating. So you can see one, very low clutter, no problem at all. By the time we have a 9, we have a pretty severe health and safety issue there. In terms of clinical focus, the 4 is where colleagues who are clinicians are noting hoarding. we actually don't start seeing hoarding code violations until roughly a 5. And so that's when we start to have the alarm bells going off with health inspectors. So again, this is a really great way for you to be able to use this. We use it not only to communicate around the severity of the health and safety, we use it with residents. If I go in and I'm working with someone and I show them this scale, they'll be able to say, you know, I'm looking at it and saying, I think it's a 7, and usually they'll say it's a 5 or a 6. If I think it's a 7 and they think it's a 2, we can see that we've got a little bit of an insight problem and need to kind of get closer together in terms of what to expect. We also use this a lot in the court process, where if we are in court for one reason or another, in an eviction case or a condemnation case, we can work with the judge to say, okay, we're at a 7 now, our goal is to get it down to a 4. That would reduce these particular health and safety violations. So it's a really great tool for using in that way. So here are some of the most common code violations. Blocked egress is by far the one that we see most often, either fully blocked or very narrow kind of blockage. Fire hazards, items on top of the stove, in the oven, those types of things. Trip hazards, crush hazards. We have about 30% of the folks that we see have some sort of squalor or sanitation issue, rotting food, feces, those kinds of things. And then we see some cases of structural safety, predominantly in owner-occupied housing, where we have risk for porch collapse or those kinds of things. So in terms of the health and safety, this is what we see most often. It's what some of the things we're going to be talking about this afternoon in the workshop. So when we're thinking about how to provide more housing stability, code enforcement obviously can't do it all. We can say, here are the risks that we're worried about, but we can't fix the problem without some help. And there are a few different ways we can do that. You can have informal partnerships. This is actually how our program started, where you have, let's say, a housing agency and a mental health clinician partnering together. You can sometimes have public health and mental health, or housing and occupational therapists, or visiting nursing. So all kinds of creative collaborations. We actually collaborate right now in the Boston area. I'm doing some work with a local church group who said, you know, the minister said, I work with addicts of all kinds, and I know that I have congregants who are struggling with issues around clutter and are in danger of losing their housing. I'd like to be able to help them as well, and so how can we partner to do that? So you can get really creative in how you think about this, but they're all informal. Then you can also have more formal collaborations. Maybe you have a memorandum of understanding between a few different organizations, public health, housing, and protective services, for example. And then we have task forces. How many of you are involved with a task force right now? I would strongly encourage you to work in your communities to start thinking about building a task force. Task forces are great because you bring together government officials, mental health providers, housing, sometimes people that are struggling with clutter problems, professional organizers, visiting nursing associations. So you can really start to develop a mental health approach, or not a mental health, a multidisciplinary approach to the problem of hoarding. You can troubleshoot different cases. Sometimes having a situation where we all sit down around a table and one person's really frustrated and needs to step back, and other people can come up with some really creative strategies. So you can do that. You can do a lot of community education as you start to build your intervention model in the area where you're working. So these are all some of the more kind of diverse ways of thinking about community collaboration. So let's talk a little bit about some of the advantages. So first and foremost, you get the opportunity to share and collaborate on cases. I can't tell you the number of times that I've gone to a meeting and said, I'm struggling with a case. I can think of one particular woman I was working with who, clutter image of about a 7. She was in a 2-bedroom apartment. It was very early on in the hoarding work that we were doing, and walked through the home, stepped up onto a good 1.5 feet of paper, and I'm walking through. There's solid wall-to-wall paper, floor-to-ceiling everywhere. And talking with her, feeling like I'm not totally sure what's going on. I can tell that there's some mental health issues that are happening. She's not being very open with me because I'm the code enforcement guy. Why would she be, right? And we start doing a little bit of decluttering work, start running into some roadblocks where there's sections where she's getting everything really, really clear, and sections where she's freezing and won't go over and talk with them. Ended up talking with her therapist a little bit and found out that one of the issues is that her fiance had been killed in a car accident a number of years prior to that. And so I wasn't seeing the connection between the physical stuff and the areas where she wasn't working. But what I found out is that I said to the therapist, you know, I'm worried. We're kind of stuck. She's been doing really well, but we're stuck. There's half of the living room where I can't get her to engage. Therapist said, why don't you step back for a week or two, and I'm going to see what I can do in the office. 2 weeks pass, and I call the therapist, okay, I've got a scheduled home visit. Where are we at? What should I expect? Anything I should know? And she said, well, turns out that the reason she will not go over into the corner of the living room where you need to get the work done for the inspection is because her fiance's stuff is all sitting over there. And so we're in the process of doing some work around that. Could you find another area of the house to work on for a few more weeks? I would never have had access to that information. I certainly don't have the skill set to provide the kind of counseling that she needed. And so that was one of the areas where a collaborative approach really worked. What we were able to do is put some things into place through the therapy so that decluttering those particular areas were a little bit less painful. She's got the right support in place to do that. The therapist actually had her bring boxes of the fiance's stuff in to sort during therapy, and that was one of the really great things that we learned around collaboration and kind of getting access to different skill sets. Greater opportunity for resource identification. Was in a situation once with a woman who had no closets in her home. We were on a very, very tight time frame because of the nature of the health and safety issues, and we needed her to store her clothing differently, to reduce the volume and store it at the same time. And we were sitting around trying to figure out, okay, we need to get some clothing racks because she's got nowhere to store this. It's going to cost some money. How are we going to do that? And one of the clinicians working on the case said, you know, I know of a church who has a fund for people who are in danger of losing their housing. I could probably go and ask that community for some funding for some clothing racks. Access to resources we wouldn't have had in the housing community, but she had through a personal connection with this particular parish. So all kinds of different ways to get creative there. One of the other things is we get to expand our knowledge set. And certainly this is the thing that I have most learned. I've gone from clean it up, I just don't care, to occasionally being confused for a social worker. And some of that is because I spend a lot of time with people who are clinical. And so when the language that I use when I'm talking with my residents is really different now. So I'll say things like, you know, I really worry about how your inspection's going to go. That's not the language I would have used. And it's entirely from partnering so much with service providers and the mental health community on cases. What I love, though, is those same clinicians who have taught me how to be a little less rough around the edges with my clients and be able to build better connections with them, also can go into a home now and see the physical health and safety issues in a very different way. They see things much more like the way a housing inspector would. And so we're able to really round out each other's skill sets. And when we're talking about the problem of hoarding, that's really important because one of the areas of conflict in community collaborations or when we can't see through other lenses. Just like often our clients can't see the problem of clutter, the safety issues, in the way that I would see them, we have the same kind of issue when we're working across disciplines. And so this kind of cross-training really helps make the collaboration a much more fluid way to work. And certainly with the economic climate being the way that it is, these cases can be very expensive, very time-consuming, very stressful, and so using a collaborative approach helps us to keep some of those costs down. It helps us to go out and see other folks. We go out when we do work, we're going into the homes of clients every 1 to 2 weeks, and so if I have someone who I can share home visits with, that means I can see twice as many clients. And so we can kind of think carefully about who we're bringing into the home and how do we strategize so we're getting the most bang for our buck, so to speak. So you've got a range of different intervention options, and we're going to break these down a lot more in the workshop later, but want to kind of give everyone a taste of what your range of options are. 10 years ago, we were going straight to cleanouts. We saw a hoarding situation, we would get a dumpster, everything was going, the resident didn't have a whole lot of control, right? Not very effective, and we know that. Now we can ideally have supportive step-by-step case management. And I know many of you are saying, I don't have time, we don't have the system. But what I want to say is we didn't 9 years ago either. And it's a little bit like Field of Dreams in my mind. If you build it, they will come. Because we've gone from having no budget and no staff to serving about 500 people over the last 9 years, and now we've got 2 full-time staff people. But that happened very slowly. It happened by collecting data to make an argument to funders. It happened by those in the enforcement community bringing cases so we knew exactly how many we had. It happened by getting enough funding to have 2 hours a week to work with a small number of clients and then building from there. So you can eventually get there. It just takes a little bit of work. Building the clinical and mental health capacity in the area is also really an important part. Building the peer response is just one that is absolutely critical because it really fills a gap and a need in a way that's very different than I would have thought of it 10 years ago. Then we have the supported clean out, which is still a clean out. One of the things you get out of the supportive step-by-step reduction of clutter is you provide people with an opportunity to learn some skills, practice some skills, make mistakes, and still have that safety net and that support. There's the room to work through the mental health and emotional components of all of this that we're asking, because it's a lot of work both physically and emotionally for folks. We don't have that with the supported clean out. Certainly there's a little bit more control in that environment where you've got a company coming in and working with the resident still making decisions in those situations, but you just don't have the freedom and the leeway in those situations to address some of the emotional needs of the resident. So it's really suboptimal in a lot of ways. Then we have the full clean out with the dumpsters and eviction and condemnation. Certainly we don't want to go down those roads if we don't have to, right? So that's your menu of options, so to speak. So I want to talk about the first of those, the supportive step-by-step case management, because that's the one that I do most often. Over the 9 years of our program, we've only done 3 supported cleanouts out of the 500 people, so we really work hard to avoid that. And that's with seeing people that are 7, 8s, and 9s on the clutter image rating, so you can still use more of a harm reduction and case management approach even in more severe hoarding situations. There's sometimes where you're not going to be able to do that if you've got severe mold, some squalor issues, things like that. But a lot of times the goal can be clean out just the bare minimum and then really switch to engage with the residents so they have full control over what's happening. Because over the long run, that's where you're going to have your long-term success. So let's talk about the program that I coordinate, the Hoarding and Sanitation Initiative, for a little bit. So our program is designed to provide individual case management. We go in and do an intake and risk assessment, and then we see people every 1 to 2 weeks for a period of time until they pass inspection. And in that time, we're actually going in and doing sorting and discarding with them. We're using many of the things that Lee put up, the questions about possessions that he would ask himself as he's trying to make decisions, help set up some rules for acquiring new items and discarding items, and kind of set some structure up in partnership with the resident. Because there's nothing more off-putting for the folks that I work with than professionals coming in and saying, I know how to solve your problem for you. And so we really do think about the collaboration with the resident as well and see our jobs less as the people who come in to fix something, and more of our role is to really facilitate options for change and help provide that additional support. So we focus on the areas of highest risk first, things like egress path, items beside a heating source, those types of things. And then once they pass inspection, one of the things we found to be most useful is we actually follow people for 1 to 2 years, and we go out every 3 months. We try and make it as unobtrusive as possible. We try and make it not feel inspection-like, so the health inspector actually doesn't do it, the case manager does it, and usually it's a pretty informal collaboration and conversation. What that allows us to do is it allows the residents to say, hey, I'm struggling around particular issues. And we've actually had people say, can you monitor me a little bit longer than that? Because I feel like it's nice just knowing you're there if I get into trouble. It allows us to kind of notice, okay, so, I'm seeing some things starting to creep into your egress path. I'm a little worried you're down to 24 inches from the 36. I wonder what got in the way. And so it's not a punitive thing, it's just how do we do some troubleshooting around all of this, right? And then whenever possible, we make referrals to other community partners. So when we get cases, we're a housing first approach, so we do a lot of wraparound services. So I'll get somebody for a hoarding case, but we'll also help them apply for SSI or food stamps or Mass Health or all of those kinds of things. So that if we stabilize all of those other smaller areas, what we find is that the health and safety issues and the clutter also seem to reduce because they're not as worried about all of these other areas that have kind of fallen apart as well. So here's what our model looks like. Referral comes in. We go out and do that intake and assessment appointment that we talked about. And then we proactively do a reasonable accommodation based on disability. So hoarding impacts one or more daily life activities. And so we can actually be proactive in saying we can give you a reasonable accommodation. Usually that looks like more time. So historically it would be 30 days, you have another inspection. If you don't pass that inspection, you get 2 more weeks. And after 2 weeks, we're going to terminate you from the Section 8 housing program. Not very realistic for time frame, right, in most of the cases that we see. And so here, what would happen is you'd have 30 days, and as long as you keep partnering with your case manager, you can get as many extensions as you need until you bring the unit into compliance. And there are some changes where if we have someone who has no egress path or if there are items on top of a stove, we have to address those a little more quickly and have an inspection. But generally speaking, people can get as many extensions as they need to bring the unit into compliance as long as they work with us to do that. 9 times out of 10, people go to this voluntary compliance. They meet with the case managers. They make slow, steady progress. We have the regular follow-up inspections. And then they pass inspection and move directly to that monitoring period where we see them every 3 months. Sometimes, though, we have folks who, because they've got physical health issues, mental health issues that they're not ready to address, things are just getting in the way. Life is difficult and things come up. It's just sort of the reality. Sometimes there are issues around insight and not being ready to acknowledge that the clutter is starting to create health and safety issues. That's why we have folks on this non-compliance track. And rather than just saying, okay, well, we tried, what we do is we actually call them into the office for the case conference. And we have one of the bigger managers in the program come in and say, this is your last shot. We're trying to work with you. Here are the particular changes we need. Are you willing to do something different? Because here's the consequences. In 30 days, if you haven't made some change, we're going to need to go directly to termination. Almost always, that gets people re-engaging with us and moving over to the voluntary compliance track. On occasion, we have to go to this program termination. The nice thing about that is, as a case manager, if I have a resident who gets to that point, I can sit down with them, sometimes over coffee, sometimes sitting in a park, wherever the resident feels comfortable, and I feel like we can have a conversation that is a little less high stakes and frightening, and say, look, I'm really concerned because I can't stop that termination if we don't change what we're doing, and I don't want to see you out on the street. And so that's when we can actually go and help them walk them through the appeals process. Just like in court, it's kind of the Section 8 version of court, and we do this in the court process as well. Where if you have someone being evicted and it's not a Section 8 voucher, we'll actually help them get an attorney and we'll go with them. And our goal in that is to come up with some sort of written case management plan that the code enforcement folks, the courts, the housing authorities, all of those folks sign on to it in cooperation with the resident. So we've got some very concrete inspection dates, and we've got some expectations. At that point, almost everybody comes over to compliance and then the monitoring. Not everybody, but almost everybody. So that's the way the model works. So we've had 175 participants from July 2011 to June of 2014. 78% of those folks lived alone. The average income is $12,000. It's not a lot of money, especially in the greater Boston area where rents are skyrocketing. And 80% of the participants lived in low and moderate income housing. And that's important for a couple of different reasons. First of all, with that, we have more access to the housing. to do inspections. We can catch the clutter problems before they get too severe, something we don't really have the opportunity to do lots of times in owner-occupied housing. It also impacts our, as you'll see in a minute, our outcomes data in terms of who engages more fully with us. In terms of, if you look at the medical and mental health data around our clients, this is all self-reported. So we haven't checked with doctors or mental health providers. We just go based on what the client said. You can see a host of different physical health problems. 63% of our folks have depression. Then we have anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder. As Dr. Frost mentioned, PTSD diagnoses are pretty low compared to what we would have thought, and then bipolar. So you compare that 12% with PTSD, and then if you look at some of our persistent personal life experiences, you can see very high rates of trauma and loss, but they don't meet the criteria for PTSD. Certainly, trauma and loss isn't going to cause a hoarding problem, but one of the things that we see in our program all the time is it certainly impacts how we think about the intervention process. I'll give you an example of that. I worked with a woman once who failed her housing inspection. She was an 8, maybe on the clutter image rating. And we went in, she had no egress path, lots of paper, lots of clothing, other flammable materials. And at that point in my career, I was only seeing the fire hazards. The alarm bells were going off. I was with another housing inspector. He went and did the housing inspection, and I stayed and chatted with the particular resident. Started meeting with her about every other week, doing some sorting and discarding just to get an egress path first, because that was the thing we were most worried about, is if there's a fire, how's she going to get out? So she's working hard. She's absolutely terrified of being homeless. I mean, just terrified, and that was her motivator, right? And so she does some great work. The inspector comes back, the path is clear. He does all of the right things and notices the changes she made, acknowledged how hard this must be for her. Come back the next week, and the path is full again. And we yo-yoed back and forth like this for a little while. And one day I sat down with her, and I was frustrated. And she was frustrated. She was on the verge of tears. And I felt like we were missing something because she's doing all of this work, and then it's all coming back. So I said to her, help me understand. You're working way too hard, and it's coming back, and I feel like I've missed something because maybe I didn't ask the right question, or maybe there's some information I don't have. Turns out she lived in a very abusive marriage for a long time. And she would take her daughter to her mom's house when the abusive situations would start. And then she had a room that she rented that had a first aid kit, a sleeping bag, and a telephone in it. That was it, nothing else. And she had certainly had some clutter challenges, but not to the level that she had at the point when I met her. So about 20 years before I met her, she had a particularly vicious assault by her then husband. She takes her child, drops the child off at mom's house, goes to her safe space. While she's in her safe space, she has the realization that he's really going to hurt or kill both of them at some point if she doesn't leave. And she's kind of gotten to that moment to say, I think I'm ready to do this, is kind of doing the planning for how am I going to get myself out of this relationship. And someone that evening broke in and sexually assaulted her as she's come to this. And this is, I think, the moment where I started to get it. Someone at dinner last night said, you know, when's that moment when it clicked from clean it up, I don't care, to where I'm at now? And I think this was that moment, right? Because you can kind of understand some things, right? So she said, as we're kind of talking, she bursts into tears. We kind of get her calmed down, and we're talking it through. And she said, you know, part of me wonders if part of what's going on is that if someone broke in now, they'd kill themselves before they got to me, right? I don't blame her. I think I'd be walling myself off too. And certainly that experience is not causing the clutter problems that she's having. But if we went and cleaned all of that stuff out, and she's not ready for that, she's not going to feel safe, and so it's going to keep coming back. And so in order to successfully intervene, what we needed to do is get her some counseling and slow things down a little bit and do things like we put up those lovely foldable screens that you can use. So we had to get a little bit creative in terms of how we thought about the intervention process as a result of some of these kinds of factors. You can see here a range of different issues. This is from the Homes tool that we'll talk about. Most houses had multiple different conditions. So we would have folks that had garbage and trash overflow and couldn't use their bathrooms and so forth. lots of different health and safety violations. The clutter image rating, that 9-photo scale that Dr. Frost and his students created, is a really great indicator for change, right? You can say, okay, a 9 down to a 6 is a huge amount in terms of reduction in clutter. So what we see in our program, if you look across all of the rooms in a home, the average clutter image rating is about a 3.7. So it's just below that 4 for clinical diagnosis of hoarding, right? When we were going through all of the inspections forms and data, as we were doing our data collection though, what we realized is that really the clutter seemed to only be a problem for most of our clients in particular rooms. So other rooms are things like basements and hallways and attics, those types of things. The first and second bedroom of the home and the living room. So these are the homes that were consistently a 4 or higher. And so when you just narrow in on the rooms where we were seeing the hoarding problem, we would get a clutter image rating of a 4.6. Using the case management approach that I've talked about, doing the step-by-step decluttering, bringing in the additional support and referrals for resources, what we're finding is it's taking about 3 to 6 months, and we're going from a 4.6 to a 2.9 on the clutter image scale. So that's a good sizable drop there. One of the other nice things though is if you look at the data for 2 years out and 3 years out for those same clients, that number stays the same. So people are able to manage their clutter in a different way, which is very different than what we would see at the beginning of our program where we were focused on get it out as quickly as we can. What we're finding in all of this is this approach is cheaper. I was a little bit surprised by that. I came into this wanting to find some ways to save us money, and lo and behold, it's about $1,800 for long-term case management through our program. Compare that to, $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 for a clean out, and in Greater Boston, an eviction is $10,000. And so in so many ways, this has been a cheaper approach for all of us. Has involved a little bit of practice change, as you can see. One of the big things is unlearning and relearning. Just like our clients are learning a whole new skill set, right? They're learning to manage their clutter differently and the emotions around it differently. We have to learn to manage our stuff differently. We have to learn to do our inspections differently, communicate differently, manage our expectations a little bit. We have to focus on not providing solutions and dictating what to do, but really kind of partnering with folks to see what are the range of options and then handing the choice over and saying, it's not my stuff, it's not my choice. I'm not here to fix it, but how can I best help you? And so that's really the piece of community collaboration that I think is most valuable, because together we're all able to provide the kinds of resources to say, here's your menu of options to the residents. How can we support you for moving forward? All right.